Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This podcast is brought to you by Wondrium, Wondrium, the former Great Courses teaching company, which I've been a fan of and a supporter of since the 1990s. Back when I used to get courses in the mail in a box with cassette tapes. That's how long ago I've been listening to their content. It's fabulous stuff. It's all digitized now, of course, and you can access it through their subscription service. So you just go to wondrium.com, Wondrium.com, and you get access to all their courses. And so hundreds of courses, thousands of lectures. And if you do it through the show, you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, you get a free month trial. And if at the end of a month of listening to just fabulous lectures, you decide you don't want to do this anymore, you don't have to, of course. But let's just give you an idea. So I just put browse history. Oh man, they just have dozens and dozens of courses in history. Here's Imperial China, great tours of Egypt, the rise of modern Japan, the Medicis, World War II battlefield Europe, communism and power, reporting 9/11, ordinary Americans in the Revolutionary War, the secret world of espionage. Ooh, let's check that one out. All right, so you just tap on the app. It is a 3-course. This is a nice short one. I can knock this one off in a single bike ride or long drive. 3 30-minute lectures, so 90 minutes. You get 1, Spies, Facts and Fiction, 2, The Human Element, and 3, The Great Game. Secret World of Espionage. Anyway, you get the idea. So subscribe at wondrium.com/Shermer. You get your 1-month free trial. And of course, you can opt out afterwards. But it's well worth it. Why would you not consume this fabulous content? It's great. It's what I've been doing for 30 years, actually even more. Go back to the 1980s with my Sony Walkman. So give it a try, and thanks for listening to the show. And thanks for supporting the show, too. My guest today is Dr. Amishi Jha. Her new book is Peak Mind. Find your focus, own your attention, invest 12 minutes a day. Now, look, I know this sounds like it's a Tony Robbins type self-help book. It's not. It's a neuroscience book. And Dr. Jha is one of the world's leading experts in neuroscience of attention. And she is a professor of psychology at the University of Miami. She serves as the director of contemplative neuroscience for the Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative, which she co-founded in 2010. She received her PhD from the University of California, Davis, and postdoctoral training at the Brain Imaging and Analysis Center at Duke University. Dr. Jha's work has been featured at NATO, the World Economic Forum, and the Pentagon. She's received coverage from the New York Times, NPR, Time Magazine, Forbes, and more. And you can watch her TED Talk on how to tame your wandering mind that has over 5 million views. You can just Google search how to tame your wandering mind and you'll find that. So we discuss the problem to be solved. That is, the fact is that 50% of our waking time is spent distracted, unattentive to the thing we'd actually like to attend to. It's just the way the mind is built, and what to do about it. So most of the conversation revolves around the details of that. But we do drill into how the mind works, how it was structured to bounce around from one task to another, and why that's actually a good thing. Most of the time, but how it can be, it can derail us from our tasks in the modern world, how our attention gets diverted from various ways. What are the major distractions? We also get into, yes, social media, what should be done about it. She's more worried about it than I am. Of course, this is her job, is to study how people get distracted, and social media is one of the big ones now. Stress and attention. We talk about thought flooding, what she calls the ruminative loop, where you get this flood of thoughts of the same thing over and over and over, and you can't focus on anything else, can't do anything about it, and so it's just a waste of time. And then what you can do about that problem. And we talk about multitasking. No one can do it. That is, you can't focus your spotlight on 2 different things at the same level. You can't do it. It's not possible. So some people are better at bouncing from one to the another, but there's always going to be a lag time in between. And then we talk about to what extent this can be trained for military people, police, first responders, and then all the rest of us. And what her lab has discovered about what kinds of specific exercises you could do, just monitoring your breath or monitoring your body, starting with your feet and working your way up. Just different ways to focus on something super simple like your breathing to take you off of that ruminative loop and other distractions that are interfering with our ability to accomplish what we want. At any rate, it was quite the fascinating and I think very useful conversation, as is her book. The book includes, she gives us a few tasks in the conversation, but the book includes a whole kind of workbook section at the end about specific exercises that you can do and exactly what you should do. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast, as usual, you can support it at skeptic.com/donate. That is a 501c3 nonprofit tax-deductible donation to the society, which supports the podcast. So if you appreciate that, go to skeptic.com/donate. I would appreciate that. All right. Thank you for your support and enjoy this conversation. All right. Hi, Amishi. Thanks for coming on the show. Nice to see you. Congratulations on the new book. I'll have already introduced it and you properly with your full biography, which is very impressive. Peak Mind. I have to tell you a funny story. I listen to most of my guests' books on audio. So I'm out on a bike ride, and I don't know how far this is into the book, page 15, and I'm listening along, and you write, I found it in the actual physical book. At the beginning of this chapter, I told you that your mind would wander, that you wouldn't be able to keep your attention steady all the way through, that you'd miss half of what I said. It was admittedly meant as a bit of a challenge for you to try, but it wasn't really fair. Imagine that instead I'd asked you to pick up the heaviest ball you can lift and then hold it in your hands the entire time you're reading with no warning or preparation. Of course, you couldn't do it for very long without training for this task first, by practicing holding up that weight for longer and longer stretches of time. So I'm listening to this going, I have no idea what this woman's talking about. I missed all of the first 15 pages. So I had to hit reverse back to the start of the intro there. So why does that happen?
Then did it make sense, I hope, the second time?
Oh, yeah.
Second time, I hope it made sense?
Yes, it did. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, that means you probably enjoy your bike ride a lot. That's my guess.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Because that's the thing about attention, right? The thing about attention is that our capacity to focus, to limit where our information processing is devoted, is singular in some sense. So we don't often, when we talk about attention, we don't talk about, well, at least in the metaphor that I like to use of attention is sort of like a flashlight. We don't talk about multiple flashlights of attention. We have a singular flashlight. So if you were enjoying the vista, which I hope you were on a nice bike ride, then of course the input from my words or the words being spoken in your ear from the audiobook are going to be diminished. So I'm glad that at least I had a little built-in check it for you to go back and check again. But it's a very normal response to...
That would be an example of your meta awareness, right? That this, you're kind of reminding me, pay attention. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to pay attention.
You got it. I'm prompting you to remind yourself to look into your own mind to see where it's been the last few minutes. So,
yeah.
But that's neat that you had that experience.
I find that when I'm listening to audiobooks, I can't do fiction. I can't follow the train of a story plot line very well, but with nonfiction I can. So I suspect it must have something to do with, you can kind of dip in and out and keep the thread with a nonfiction book for whatever reason. But with novels, I can't seem to do that as well. So I'm not sure. It's just the structure of how stories are told versus how information is presented.
If you're building, right, if you're building an entire simulated reality, and typically, something like Harry Potter, you're really having to hold that visual in your mind, for example. That's going to take up a lot of processing bandwidth. So the sights and sounds around you, maneuvering through the world in real time can be very, very challenging. So I would recommend against it if you want to enjoy either where you're at or what you want to read or listen to.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of personal stories in your book about your family and your kids, and then the last page of the book. Wow, I mean, it was shocking to hear that final story. Do you want to maybe reflect, give our listeners a bit of background of who you are and where you came from and your education, how you got interested in neuroscience and the study of attention, but maybe use these examples from your personal life?
Yeah, so it was interesting, the story that you talk about at the end, and there was a reason for mentioning it, which is just to kind of start there. I wanted to make the title of the book Peak Mind. And oftentimes when people hear that term, the image they get in their mind is of some kind of successory poster, like woman on mountaintop, achieves glory. She made it to that beautiful destination and she's journeyed so long. But it was a play on that idea, because essentially in my mind, a peak mind is not a singular moment. It is a way of training your mind to optimize your full ability to be present in all the moments of your life. And that doesn't need to mean that it's always happy or even interesting or consequential. But the more chances we have and we give ourselves to sample the reality that we're in, I think the more fulfilled we'll be, for sure. So that's sort of where that whole thing comes from. So my training and my kind of professional journey really starts out as a researcher, as a neuroscientist. And I was interested in the brain for a very long time, since I was in high school, actually, just curious about how this thing functions, this complex organ that we carry around in our skull. And I was particularly interested in how it kind of reconfigures itself, how it's capable of changing and growing and shifting, and how our experience determines how that's going to happen. Whether that means we spend a long time kind of ruminating and feeling negative, and then those circuits will kind of build up in our day-to-day experience, or we see the world in a different way and we orient to the world in a different way, and that'll be our reality. So the notion that the brain can change itself was always interesting, and in particular attention was interesting because of its sort of evolutionary history. The reason we developed an attention system really is because the brain suffered from a very big problem with too much information in the external environment than it could fully process. So, and in many ways, it was like the brain had gone, it would be dark, like there'd be no clear or a cacophony, either one. And so attention allowed this capacity, and that going back to this notion of a flashlight or a spotlight, attention allowed some entry of a specific subset of information to come in for information processing so you could more fully see what was going on. So it is like having a flashlight in a darkened room. All of a sudden, some aspect of your environment has more kind of granular clarity that's available to you, and then we can kind of move it around in space. But in doing that, we harness the entirety of the brain and kind of reconfigure all of its processing for the purposes of just that sampling that we do. So my interest initially was just in how the heck does this thing work in the brain? How, if we have these metaphors of a flashlight, et cetera, how is it changing information processing? But what I learned pretty quickly is, well, yes, for sure, attention is very powerful. It does actually transform brain function, but it's also fragile. It can fall apart very, very easily. And the kinds of things that make it fall apart are very common human experiences. But for certain professions, those experiences are kind of descriptive of the professional milieu. So high stress, consequential, high performance, threatening, volatile, uncertain, those kind of situations that we know will diminish attention's power. We need our attention to be maximally effective in those moments. So my work went from sort of basically understanding how it works to understanding how it doesn't work so well to training it in terms of the trajectory of what we've been up to in my lab for the last 25 years or so.
Yeah, you have some amazing stories of working with the military and the Pentagon and world leaders. How did they find you? How did they know about your research? That's just amazing. You've been able to have these opportunities.
I don't know if they found me or I found them, but having several back-to-back Department of Defense grants and then actually getting the word out there that it's a very desirable thing if you can up level your performance so that in the midst of some of the most demanding circumstances that leaders, that service members, that first responders, even medical and nursing professionals and business leaders find themselves in, where they know things are going to be compromised. They may become paralyzed by the complexity of the situation or emotion dysregulation. If you can figure out a way to up level that by training, people get interested. I think that all of us would be. And that's what I was able to convey is what we're doing and what we're finding in our work.
Yeah, so when I first saw the title of your book come across my desk, I thought, oh my God, it's another one of these Tony Robbins, you know, be your peak self and, kind of self help. But of course, he's successful, people like him, because people are looking for ways to, what did you say, upload, upgrade,
Up
um,
level, up level. Yeah.
level. Yeah, because it's a
Yeah.
problem for all of us. So, and yet it seems almost impossible not to be constantly distracted. So, kind of walk us through a little brain evolution and how the mind works and why attention evolved the way it did. I think if I recall, you're arguing it's not a bug in the system; it's a feature. If we could only ever focus our spotlight on one thing, that would probably not be good, right? It's good to kind of bounce around because of external threats that could pop in from anywhere.
Yeah, you got it. And in fact, if you think about things like attention deficit disorder or even certain kinds of degenerative diseases where we find that frontal lobe functioning is becoming compromised, you'll see things like hyperfocus, where somebody's so locked in they cannot disengage, and that will cause problems. So the fluidity with which we're able to focus when we want to, broaden when we need to, monitor whether our behavior is aligned with our goals, these are all ways in which our attention functions. And doing that fluidly, dynamically, responsive to the environmental inputs we have, responsive to our own evolving thoughts, that's what makes us uniquely capable as human beings, frankly. And so, yeah, when attention was sort of coming into play in the course of a species evolution in some sense. Like I said, initially it was you've got this brain, it cannot possibly function to understand everything around it. So it's going to take a different approach, which is fine. If we can't understand everything, let's just sample the environment to get a sense of it. And then we'll build up what the world must look like on the and in the external environment by piecing it together, kind of like a puzzle. And that's what this sort of spotlight or flashlight version of attention allows us to do. We can narrow and direct that attentional focus and get more information there. And that's great when you want to have content that you get kind of known within the brain. But there's another way in which you could actually pay attention. And we do this all the time as well. I mean, we know what it means to focus, right? We know what it means to direct your brain's attentional resources. Right now, Michael, you're looking at me, you're focused on my words. You're not on your phone, and you're probably not thinking about the sound, in some other part of your home or wherever you're sitting. You're able to really devote your brain's computational resources on one target. But if you are driving down the road or walking, and all of a sudden you see this flashing yellow light, probably near a construction site or maybe a school or something, the way you pay attention is going to be quite different. You're going to be broad, receptive, vigilant. And you're not going to advantage any part of the scene. You're going to just try to hold everything in mind because what you're looking for is something that may require you to then take action, right? Then to guide the flashlight to do something. But you don't know what that is. So whereas the narrowing component, the focusing aspect, privileges some information over other information, this broad receptive stance, something I call the floodlight of attention, something formally called the alerting network, that makes us capable of being vigilant, broad, receptive, observational, which we know what that feels like when we're like that. And I think it's important to realize both of these things that we're doing all the time. And then sort of the third way we can orient our attention or direct our attention is not so much by the content we want to get, or you might even say with the vigilance approach, it's about what's happening right now. So if you're walking down the street and you see a flashing yellow light, you're not thinking, oh, I wonder what happened here yesterday or tomorrow. It's like, in this moment, what should I be attentive to in this broad receptive way? So content, time, in the case of this vigilance approach. And then the third way is really regarding our goals. What is it that we want to be paying attention to? What is the goal of the moment? And if the goal is to interact with another person, that's going to be where you should be focusing. If it's to actually deliberate on a problem space in your own mind, that's where your attention should go. So we can bias our information processing based on any of these three approaches. And doing so with flexibility and fluidity, like I was saying a moment ago, is so key to being able to function in this very complex world we live in.
Hmm. Yeah, I had Matthew Cobb on the podcast last year. He had he has a new book about the use of metaphors in trying to understand how the mind works. And the problem is, of course, the mind has to use itself to understand itself, which is difficult. You can't sense the mind operating, which is one of my explanations, by the way, for apparently paranormal and other anomalous psychological experiences. The person that hears the voice or sees the vision, they see it and hear it out there, not in here, because you can't detect the auditory trackways operating. Although Oliver Sacks used to write about these sorts of anomalous experiences, and one of his last essays was about that auditory hallucinations actually do register in MRI scans,
Mm-hmm.
even though the person
Yeah.
says, "I'm not. It's not there. It's out there. I'm hearing it out there." Right. So I'm fond of saying that experiences people have are real. What we want to know is it real in there or is it real out there? Of course, the person that has the near-death experience, they feel like they've gone somewhere, and yet most of it scientists think, well, it's all in there. So that's part of the problem you have. So when you use metaphors like spotlight, floodlight, and whatever the third one would be, of course, those are just metaphors. You're just trying to get us a way to think about how the mind works. But for brain scan research and neuroscience aspects, are there different neural networks that are operating with
Yeah.
the spotlight versus the floodlight? And can you see those in scans?
Yes. In fact, that's where I kind of reverse engineered the way that I would describe this to people that don't care about brain networks, right? So, because what we understand is its function. Its function is select and direct for the flashlight. Okay. And what do we see? Oh, we see this particular node of the prefrontal cortex. We see a parietal lobe activation. We see visual cortex when you direct that flashlight to visual input. If all of a sudden we're directing our flashlight to auditory information, like I'm listening to see if, I hear the door banging on the other side of my house, we'll still see that frontal and parietal node, but now all of a sudden we're going to see auditory cortex. So we know what parts of the network are really tied to the function and then what parts are the recipient of that. And for sure, these are identifiable networks. So the formally this flashlight network would be called the brain's orienting system, and we see it as this frontoparietal network. We know if people get lesions in any one of those spots, they can't do this function any well. They cannot direct their attention, which is it's a very interesting thing. What's left over is essentially they can't willfully do it, but if you clap your hands, they'll move their head. So it can be yanked, it just cannot be voluntarily directed. So we know a lot about these networks. In fact, the alerting network, which has a different set of nodes that create it, um, and also the third network, which we call the executive network, which is really like, like I said, the executive of a company where we've got goals and behavior and we want to make sure that they're aligned. All three of these networks are identifiable from brain imaging. And what's very cool about them is that they are mutually antagonistic. So if one is prominent, the other one is not going to be as prominent, and there's going to be a tipping point. So if you recall the last time you were talking about reading fiction, so I'm assuming you're not going to read a fiction, you're not going to listen to a fiction book, you're going to read it. So you're sitting there, you're engrossed, you're in this universe that's been created through this book. Somebody walks in the room and starts talking to you, Michael, blah 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 blah. It'll take you a beat before you kind of even register that somebody has walked in. So in some sense, when that orienting network is so hyper focused and in the world being created, the vigilance network is a little dialed down. It's not like you don't hear them at all, but it'll take you a little bit longer to do that. And that is because of this antagonistic relationship. At some point, you'll tip, you'll hear it, and you'll direct your attention to that person. So, there's a lot of benefits and costs to having this mutual antagonism. And the fourth thing I wanted to tell you that's not a network I've mentioned so far, but is actually at play with all of this is something called, and maybe you've talked about this in another with other guests, but something called the default mode network of the brain. And one of the reasons we refer to it as the default mode is just sort of the history of brain imaging. But it's if you put somebody in a brain scanner and you say, just rest, don't do anything, we're not going to give you a task to do. By default, this network will be active. And it was a big mystery of figuring out what the heck this network is doing. All we're doing is saying rest. Why is there anything specifically and systematically activated? And the way you'd look at it is you'd contrast it with say 5 minutes, just rest. Okay, now for the next 5 minutes, do something very, very attentionally demanding. Like, you're looking at a screen, you're tracking dots or something like that. Okay, now the next 5 minutes, rest again. So every time we'd have those rest periods, this default mode would show up. And every time we'd have those attention periods, we'd have these other networks show up depending on the task. And so, it was a mystery. What the heck is going on? All we said was rest. So we'd ask people, what did you do when we told you to rest? And they'd say things like, oh, I was planning my day, or I was thinking about this conversation. I was thinking about how boring this is, how loud it is in here. Basically, every comment we got was regarding themselves. and they were the central character. They were not thinking about the problems with the shipping arrangements and the cargo containers that are sitting on the side of the
Mm-hmm.
ocean. It was always personal, and it was always
Mm.
kind of an inner journey regarding how they felt about it. So we almost kind of, in a comical way, talk about it's not rest, it's rapid, ever present, self related thinking. That's what people are doing. So, in some ways, these attention networks are all about primarily engaging with and interacting with the external environment. When it comes to the internal milieu, whether that is our opinions, our thoughts, our memories, that is going to be a different network. And those are also antagonistic with each other.
Mm.
So if I'm having a very personal dilemma and I am preoccupied with that, my ability to pay attention to the road while I'm driving may become slightly compromised because
Mm.
I'm pulled in instead of being able to view the external environment.
Just rehashing your own day or what you're going to do next. Yeah, that's interesting. That kind of makes me think of the theory of mind reading that we do with other people, which everybody writes about. But maybe what you're talking about is we're doing it with ourselves. I'm mind reading myself, my future self, let's say, in the next hour. This is what Shermer's going to do. The future Shermer tomorrow is going to do this, or tonight I'm going to do that, whatever. Is it something like that? That's the default mode?
I love you don't totally keyed in on your insight regarding brain organization is awesome because exactly what you just described was mind traveling, right? Like you might think, oh, I wonder what Amishi's thinking right now in this conversation. I wonder how she's feeling about it. We had a little trickiness with her headphones. Like you're going into my mind and kind of looking back at the situation from my perspective. But the same basic brain network, in fact, it is part of this default mode network that does time traveling as well. And time traveling is, as you said, we are displacing ourselves not from the present, away from the present moment. So now we are reflecting on the past, rewinding the mind, if you will, or fast forwarding. And and again, the central character of that journey is typically us. We're reflecting on our experience of the past or our speculation regarding the future. And when we do that, we take our attention along for the ride. So our attention is no longer in the present moment. It too is in the past or the future, which is a very, we were talking earlier about feature flaw, very powerful feature of the brain. In fact, in some ways, this is what makes us different from our dogs and cats, is that we're projecting ourselves in time. And we're doing that consciously, not just by some kind of rote stimulus response, kind of Pavlovian way of remembering the past, right? So, but it can actually go awry in that when it goes into overdrive and we're time traveling or mind traveling, let's just start with time traveling. We're not just reflecting on the past or the future. We may be ruminating. You may be like yanked there back over and over again about some difficult event or past memory, maybe potentially a traumatic memory, or we're pulled to the future now and we're looping on some kind of catastrophic worry we've got. So now it's not functional anymore. Now we're actually just displaced. Or when we're mind traveling, we're judging the situation in a way that is socially problematic. Like, oh, Amishi's thinking about X, Y, or Z, and it's like in an evaluative sense, like she's evaluating me. So we don't always do this productively. And it's often most problematic for us to maneuver in this moment when our attention is yanked around in time in that way. Because we're usually not privy to the fact that our mind is doing this. We're just landed there, and it takes some other thing to jar us and think, oh my gosh, I just spent the last 10 minutes. I have no idea. Sort of like what you were saying happened to you on the bike ride, that it took some other stimulus for you to say, oh, wow, I wasn't really paying attention to what was going on, at least to the level I wanted to.
Yeah, that reminds me. My wife tells me I don't really listen to her. At least I think that's what she said. I wasn't really listening. Anyway. Okay.
Said every wife ever and every husband ever.
That's a Seinfeld joke. I have to give credit where it's due.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of Louis Leidenberg's research. He's a historian of science, but also a professional tracker. He does persistence tracking, and he works with the San Bushmen in Africa. And he talks about he did a story for us in Skeptic on the evolution of rationality, hypothesis testing, thinking scientifically. This isn't something brand new. We didn't just invent that way of thinking in the last 400 years. That, in fact, probably our ancestors did this. And the examples he uses is a lot of the inferences they make from tracking, from tracks. You have like the kinds of footprints. So, it's this kind of animal. We know it's a mammal. It's going to be a hot day. We could see that he was lying here under the bush because you could see his body imprint. Then you could see the tracks go off this way. And the water's over there. The sun is this high. So he must have left about an hour ago. So our prediction is he went to those sets of bushes over there on the way to the water. So you make a prediction, they test the hypothesis, there he is or not. The hypothesis is falsified, they form a new hypothesis. But he points out that they also do time traveling. They're thinking of what the animal would be doing, so mind reading, and then in the future, so they have to travel as if they're the animal and so on. Pretty much all the components of modern cognition that we think of as rationality and reason and science, we're already there in the brain. We just are kind of fine-tuning it with our methods to adjust for bias, so you have the blind and double blind and randomized controlled conditions and things like that. But those are all just fine-tuning the cognition that's already in there.
Absolutely. I don't think that these are particularly new functions, and I don't think science came out of thin air, right? It came on leaning on ways information processing and problem solving have been happening. I think the thing that becomes very interesting about this whole enterprise is, though, when we start using these same powers of rationality and simulation of mind and predicting the future, learning from the past, when we find ourselves using them in dysfunctional ways, can we get out of them? So, for example, can you think your way out of a ruminative loop? And the answer is typically no. It's like we've run to the end of thinking as the way out. I guess I'm kind of restating what I just said. And that's a very interesting place. And actually, that's exactly why some of the solutions that we've come to become compelling to me, because they're outside the scope of typical cognitive functioning and even superior cognitive functioning, you might say. In the book, I talk about it as almost an addiction to thinking. We think, especially with strategic leaders and consequential leaders, they think thinking is the superior approach. And oftentimes it's the worst approach, because to know whether the thoughts you're having, the plans you're making are correct or not, you better have a very good idea of what the situation is. And knowing the situation does not involve thinking, it requires observing. And you've got to do it without imposing a story.
Ruminative loop, that's such a great expression. Is that like thought flooding, where I just keep thinking about my boss said this and I should have said that, or some problem and I just can't stop thinking about it?
Right. So rumination. So you're saying the same concept is just circulating over and over again. And it's a loop because it's not going anywhere. It's sort of self-contained. Just like you said, some bad event happened, let's say a particularly difficult interaction. You said something and then you're kind of replaying it over and over again. And you're not getting out of anything. You're not expanding your thinking. You're not seeing it differently. You're not actually feeling any better. Usually it tends to drive down mood. And so here's an example of the same brain hardware and the same processes, but now we end up in a very dysfunctional state of mind.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into how to deal with all that in a minute, but I just wanted to drill down into some of the brain stuff. So this default mode showed us that in brain scans that this you only use 10% of your brain myth is a bunch of baloney. You're always using your brain. It's always operating. So for you guys running fMRI brain scan experiments, you actually have to engage the subject to do this thing and then that thing, so you can see the difference in blood flow from one area to another, which is correlated with neural activity. So there is that presumption there. You're not actually measuring neural firing, you're measuring blood shifting around in order to get out of that default mode. So the brain is always operating. So what you're talking about with attention is it's just shifting from one thing to another, from this default mode of this kind of self reflection and to this thing you're giving them to do, this task. Here, I want you to press the button when you see this on the screen or whatever. Now they're focused, and then you stop, and then you see what the brain does, so that then you can tell which parts are lighting up, so to speak.
Yeah. But by the way, as you can imagine, this plot thickens. It's not so simple to have attention networks in default mode, because when you want to drive a train of thought. So now I'm not stuck in rumination. I'm actually having an idea and I want to pursue the idea. Like, for example, I'm thinking, I don't know, I want to go to my child's school, but I want to go because there's something wrong with my car. I only want to go by making left-hand turns or something bizarre like that, right? Where there's a goal, I've got to achieve that, but there's like a problem space. And so I'm kind of visualizing, but I know what the goal is. So I have to keep I'm attending, but it's internal and I want to problem solve. Then what happens is that it may have been initiated by the default mode because it's self-related and it's a particular problem I have. But now I'm going to use those attentional networks to drive the train of thought. And this is what I mean by there's a constant back and forth, a dynamic relationship between internal and external attention, and even whether you're being narrow or broad, or when you're bringing in your goals. So it becomes quite complicated very quickly. And the 10% myth, we don't need to worry about the default mode to know that that's complete BS. You put somebody in the scanner, and the first thing you need is a baseline. The baseline basically is the entirety of the brain is active at some level. So we got to take that away. We got to subtract that out so we can see, based on the thing we want to study, how much above and beyond, how much percent signal change is there above the baseline. But the baseline is never zero. So we know that the entirety, it would just make no sense. If you
Yeah,
actually
of
just
course.
probe that 10% myth, it's like, this is the most metabolically costly organ in our body. Why would we only use
Mm-hmm.
10% of it? It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, just to follow up on that, it just wanted to say one more thing, which is that's the wrong-headed approach to think about the brain as modular or parsed into pieces. Essentially, anything we do is some combinatorial result of the entirety of the brain. I mean, if you think of the brain, and every brain cell is like a mixing board, it's like the entirety of the brain is every lever on that mixing board. Sometimes you've got the gain up, and sometimes you've got the treble down, and sometimes the bass is up. Whatever it is, those are all different set points, but they're all engaged at some level. And even when certain parts of the brain are quiet, so to speak, that's an active, effortful process to suppress certain regions and certain networks so that other regions can be prominent. Hope that makes sense.
Then, yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and I think you're right. But then, how do you square that with there's certain neural networks dedicated to do certain things, like the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe is associated with facial recognition, and people that have damage to this area can't see faces, so that's where the face recognition software is located. Or, Christoph Koch's
Uh,
famous example of the Jennifer Aniston neuron, the grandfather neuron, or the Jennifer Aniston neuron that only fires when you see a picture of Jennifer Aniston. Well, that just can't be that simple. That's your point?
oh yeah, no, I think that's the point. Is that it's but I think we have to think in more systems, a systems point of view. I think a modular view has not served us, and there's always going to be a tension within the specificity of the smallest unit of the brain, a neuron, and networks and network interactions and dynamic connectivity between networks. I mean, this is why brain science is not done yet. We're still trying to figure how the heck it works, but we know that thinking that a singular region does complex functions is wrong.
And then how do you think about your research with Dan Kahneman's metaphor of system one, system two, rapid cognition, deliberative cognition? Again, these are just ways of talking about different ways that people think at different times. But are they forms of different kinds of attention?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's so funny because I know Daniel Kahneman, because I was a big fan of his wife, Anne Treisman, who was
Oh, right.
like one of my heroes. She was an attention researcher. She unfortunately passed
Hmm.
recently. So I'm like, oh yeah, she's the famous woman that happens to be married to that Nobel laureate. So it's kind of funny
That's
how we
funny. I didn't
orient
know that.
things. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. So she was amazing actually. And I think that these are different ways of attention operating, and it makes sense that we would have more deliberative processes and automatic processes. And in some ways, when we were talking back about the flashlight, the deliberate aspect would be the planful use of directing attention. The automatic would be, I hear some loud noise and I'm going to move my flashlight over there. The system itself, the capacity to narrow and direct attention, may be agnostic with respect to its use. It's sometimes going to be driven by goal directed behavior, and other times it's going to be driven by threats that pull on us. So I don't see it as problematic. I think in our modern world, it can become actually quite problematic, though, because now I want to sit there and put my flashlight on the email I want to write, but my text messages keep coming in, and so now the flashlight, which is there's only one of, cannot be devoted toward this thing because it keeps getting pulled by this other set of stimuli that's driving its use. And frankly, I would say this is why we're experiencing the modern crisis of attention. Our attentional functioning has not changed over the 20 years. That's nothing when it comes to evolutionary change. But what is different is that the presence of technology and social media, et cetera, puts the use of these same systems in competition, whether it's sort of system, the system that is driving it voluntarily versus automatically getting pulled.
So someone who thinks they're good at multitasking, which you show is not possible, you can't do two things at the same time. All they're saying is that I can flip back and forth and bounce around and refocus my spotlight on this and then shift it over to there without being too distracted. And some people just can't do that, but no one could do it at the same time.
Yeah, they're very, I mean, if something is attentionally demanding, you cannot do two things that are attentionally demanding at once. And so you don't multitask, you task switch. And that's that back and forth thing. And some people may be better at it than others, but all of us will suffer certain features of what this does, which is basically there's going to be a lag time when you go from task A to task B and then switch back to task A. It's going to take you a minute because your brain essentially has to reconfigure what the priorities are for that particular context. There's also greater chances of mistakes when you're switching back and forth. So again, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about our modern context. Somehow people think they can do this, which is, I think, false. They have a lot of attentional hubris. It's like, oh, my attention's fine. But do you think other people are great at this? Probably nobody thinks other people are great at this. It's just sort of like texting while you're driving. Nobody would say, oh, yeah, I think most people are fine at doing this. We'd say, it's terrible, don't do it. Yet sometimes people will do it themselves and think somehow they're special. Their brain isn't capable of, veering off the road because they can keep focused, but we cannot.
Yeah, another
So,
attribution bias. Yeah, I can do it, but you can't.
yeah,
um,
right.
yeah, I'm glad you talked about the famous gorilla counting the basketball passes while the gorilla walks across the screen. Dan Simon's research. When he first introduced that, I always thought his description of inattentional blindness was the wrong label. The problem is people are so attended. And when he first came out, the results were 50% of subjects didn't see the gorilla. For the two people out of my 100,000 listeners who haven't heard of this, the subjects are tasked with watching two sets of people passing two basketballs around, white shirt, black shirts, and your task is to count the number of passes by the white shirted players, and the number is 15. And but that's irrelevant. In the middle of the thing, a guy in an ape suit walks across. I think it was a woman in an ape suit actually, and pounds on her chest and waves her arms and then exits. So the whole thing is like 10 seconds long out of the 60-second video, and so 50% miss it. So I used to show this in my public talks, and I could get it where no one would see the gorilla if I had everybody count out loud, the entire audience, and then. To me, it wasn't that they were inattentive. It was that I got them super attended. And so it seems like it's attentional blindness. This is your spotlight. We're so good at this.
Yeah.
If you can direct people to be really good at it, they're going to miss everything outside of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of two sides of the same coin, right? Your attention is allowing you to see exactly the number of passes, so you're inattentive to this whole other domain of the black shirted or anything basically in the color that's black, and you're blind to it. And I think that's such a great example of what I mean by this attentional flashlight. Also, it is like it's darkened beyond, everything that is not in this flashlight's focus is darkened, just like it would be in a darkened room. But I agree with you that it's showing us not a failure, not a gotcha, but the power of this incredible capacity to blank out something like a gorilla. I mean, it says the power of our mind, but it also tells us our vulnerability, which is that we might miss stuff. And frankly, it's doing the same thing we were saying a moment ago, which is these two systems, the noticing network, the vigilance network, and this focusing network are antagonistic. We can't probably have both just equally active at once.
Yeah, if I recall, there was some research with pilots and trainers, in which they got them so focused on the instruments that they missed. And they would put a plane like right in the middle of the runway, and the guys in the trainer would just plow right through the plane. I guess they're trying to
it's
teach them,
terrible.
you have to be able
Don't
to
do
be
that.
not, yeah, don't do that. Yeah.
Be
Don't be,
situationally aware. Yeah.
yeah. So let's talk about the different ways that we get distracted and lose our attention and what we can do about it. So what are some of the major distractors in life, and what should we do about it?
Well, I think that the main ones are, the external environment we've already talked about. So essentially, that same system of attention that we can use to direct our computational resources, focusing, what we call formally the orienting system, can get captured by other types of stimuli. And the stimuli that tend to do it are everything that advantaged our survival: threatening, fear inducing, self related, bright, shiny things. You might say sex, drugs, rock and roll, anything that's going to entice you and maybe potentially even an advantage your survival at some level, it's going to pull you. So you're sitting there trying to write that report again, and the ding goes off. Well, in some sense, that same network is going, something that's alarming and alerting. I better check it out. So these notifications on our phone or social media apps. I mean, it's not an accident that you have your own photograph when you pull up an app, or that the sound is alarming. I mean, these are intentional to grab you and pull you. So the external thing, I think, is just because we're constantly negotiating what we want to get done with the pull of other things in the environment. But when it comes to other sources of distractibility that really do disable and almost can cripple attention, all three systems of attention that we talked about, um, what we found and what the kind of field is suggesting is it's things like stress, meaning the experience that your capacity to meet the challenges in the moment, your capacity to meet the challenges does not equate to what is required to successfully maneuver through those challenges. So you're not quite up to snuff to get the thing done. And then threat. So it could be physical threat, like just the notion that somebody's going to break into my house. Just that thought could make me feel it will hijack my attention in a very robust manner. Or psychosocial threat. Somebody's going to evaluate me in a way that is going to threaten my reputation or my livelihood, or my ability to have a successful future, or whatever it is. And then the third one, so stress, threat, and then the third one is negative or dysphoric mood. So it goes back to that rumination we were talking about. When we experience negative mood, again, our attention will become compromised. And, I was saying at the outset that a lot of the groups that we've worked with in my lab, such as, the military service members, first responders, et cetera, you cannot have circumstances where those things, none of those things are happening. And frankly, if we even think of leaders in any enterprise, that's when leadership is called upon, not when everything's hunky dory. I mean, maybe you're going to have a nice congratulatory dinner with your leader in that sense, but most of the time when the leaders have to actually enact his or her best performance, it's when there's a heightened degree of stress, threat, and probably a lot of negative mood happening. So that's the motivation behind why we want to find solutions, is because we know that we'll need our attention even when the circumstances may diminish its availability. And by the way, it's diminished because it's getting hijacked by all these different things. It's time traveling and mind traveling inappropriately to the point where it's exhausting. The almost, you might say, the cognitive fuel. I mean, again, to use another metaphor, but and we see it in our task performance. We bring people into the lab and have them do something for as little as 10, 15 minutes. And we just see a decline in their performance. If we inject just disturbing images, that rate goes faster down. The slope of decline is greater. So, this is
What
this
kind of
is very
disturbing
clear
images?
vulnerabilities. Actually, it's sad to say they're so disturbing because all we did is get them from social, like news media, news clips. A fire, a burning building, some kind of catastrophic thing and happening in a lot of different parts of the world. This is not something you might not see very often if you just scroll on your phone. But what we know is that when we embedded those versus negative images versus neutral images, when the images were negative repeatedly interspersed throughout this very boring task, performance started to decline, rapidly decline, and significantly decline. So, I mean, I think that paints the picture of the problem space we're dealing with a distraction.
Yeah. Now, would that be an evolved mechanism for paying attention to the really bad thing and quit thinking about all the other boring tasks because that bad thing is, a threat.
Right. But now when it's a threat, meaning it's an image of something that happened in another part of the world 2 weeks ago that you just
Oh,
happen to see in your
right.
news feed, is it appropriate that your mind is so captured by
Yeah,
that
I see. I
and that you're
see.
spinning on it and that it's disabling you? Or if it's a movie, it's just happens to be something that you didn't know was a movie, right? So it's the same basic mechanism, but we have to really be aware of its power on us. And I think probably the most problematic is we create doomsday scenarios all the time in our minds. We don't need even external stimuli. I mean, I think about back to the pandemic, like, this the notion of volatility and uncertainty in our world. It's a very real thing. And not knowing, if I walk outside, if I go to the grocery store, I thankfully, I mean, I feel particularly like we're moving in a better direction now. And I just had my third booster shot, so I feel particularly
All
invincible.
right.
But, but, but what I was saying is that if the calculation is if I go to get milk at the grocery store, could I die? I mean, that's just not a, the human brain is just not usually used to having to do that. And that will definitely derail your attention. You're probably not going to think about much other than that.
Yeah. Well, this kind of reminds me of the negativity bias and the research by Roy Baumeister and Paul Rosen and others on, how negative things hurt twice as much as positive things feel good. And to get somebody to take a risk, the payoff has to be twice what the loss would feel like, and so on. And then all the other research, like, negative words impact us more than positive words. And, I could get 100 positive comments on a tweet, but I notice the one really bad one or two really bad ones, and that bugs me for the rest of the day. But there's probably good evolutionary reasons for that because, negative thing, there's more ways for things to go wrong than to go well. And so we should be focused on the different ways that we could be taken out of the gene pool. Whereas most good things happen gradually, slowly over time. You don't really notice them. So the news, for example, the availability heuristic, that we assess risks based on the things that come to mind immediately, which is usually images in the news. Yeah, but that's their job. I mean, there's no camera crew at the school that didn't have a shooting today. There's no camera crew at a country that's not undergoing conflict or revolution. So it's all kind of wrapped up in this system we have. And now social media is, the part of the national conversation. What should we do about it? I'm very conflicted about this, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. There was this this Netflix documentary, Social Dilemma, in which I think it was Tristan Harris and a few of the other ex-tech employees who invented the like button and other things to trick you into getting addicted to their social media platforms. That's their job. They're there to make money, to get clicks, to sell ads, and so on. And but these guys were kind of self-flagellating as if they were J. Robert Oppenheimer who invented the nuclear weapon, and this is existential threat to me. I felt this was going way too far. But then sometimes when I talk to younger people, like my students or even younger than that, it does sound pretty bad. It sounds pretty distracting, not just distracting, but depressing. Like they experience depression, anxiety. We know there's a threefold increase in teenage girls, about a full 1.5 times for boys, but about 3 times for girls, in cutting anxiety, suicidal ideation, and depression from like 13 to 16, 17, something like that. So maybe this is dangerous. And I'm an old baby boomer, so what do I know? I'm not addicted to this stuff, but I could kind of see how that could happen. So how do you think about to what extent we should do something about social media? Is it really a threat?
Oh, I 100% think we need to do something about it. But what we need to do is the debate. So I think in some sense, it reminds me a lot of sort of like the mortgage crisis. We have a lack of regulation in an industry. It ends up that the commodity that they're selling is our attention, and we're slicing and dicing people's attention. And it's unregulated. There's nobody actually taking into account what is going on. So I think that putting a lens of that aspect is very important. But I don't think that that's going to be the only solution because right now, if your choices are break up with your phone and throw your computer in the
Yeah, it's not going
river,
to happen.
or live in the current world, what are you going to choose? Of course, you're going to keep everything as it is because you need to function. It's like food. We need it. And the advice I would say, or not really advice, but the guidance based on what we're thinking about in my lab is that we have to take the same kind of solution-based approach that we do with everything we do, which is to pay attention to what we are doing moment to moment, to know where our mind is, and not to default to an automatic interaction with anything. So, if what the reason social media companies are able to allow people to sit and doom scroll for hours on end with any knowledge, which does lead to unfortunate consequences like psychological health problems, serious psychological health problems in many, what can we do? Well, okay. I mean, I think about what my kids have done has been kind of interesting. They're 15 and 19, and my daughter, I said, what do you do about social media? She's like, well, I just got rid of all my apps. She just got rid of
Hmm,
all of them. And I'm like, well, what about if you need
really?
it to go on? And she said, well, I use a timer. So she put a piece of software on that times her out, and it's funny because sometimes she'll have to get around it. Like if she needs to go to YouTube to watch some video, she's watched it for, she uses, she's like, I only have 3 minutes. Can I just use your phone to watch the last 2 minutes? And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm not policing you. So it's very interesting because I think you're right. The pain point is real. And she figured out that if she needed to function and get schoolwork done, she better have another approach, which I actually commend her on. I think it's very interesting, but I think it's helping her. But it's a very externally driven approach. She's not putting any of the control back in her own hand. And at this age, at 15, do what you need to do to to make it work. But what we can do, in addition to these externally based parameters, because essentially she's not throwing her phone away, but she's limiting her phone use, which is a decent solution. But the other thing we can do is use that term that you used earlier, meta awareness. Apply our meta awareness to our technology use. So we're not. What does that mean? That means that you're not just on the phone, on the app, scrolling without any knowledge. Because often we end up there. It's like you wake up from a fog and you're. It's been 10 minutes and you're like, where did the time go? It's to notice. I have the urge to pick up my phone. Oh, look at that. The face identification let me in. I'm clicking on a button. Like if you are watching the mind at every step, the chances of you being able to intervene will be greater. So now you're seeing images or you're seeing certain kind of content, and of course the algorithm is going to feed you more of that. You can be aware, like, oh, I don't need to see the 10th video of a cat, or whatever it is that it's got you in a loop doing. I'm done.
Hmm.
And what I often guide people to do is have the intention before you start the engagement. So use the face identification software unlocking your phone as a reminder, as a cue to say, what is the goal of my interaction? What do I want to achieve? If it's I need to figure out what the weather is in the town I'm going to visit, accomplish that and put it down. It's like if you hold the goal at the front of your mind, the chances of you reining in your behavior moment by moment are going to be greater. But it's using all three of those systems again. About focusing, about noticing what that is, and then the goal is kind of guiding you in terms of what you're doing. So I see a lot of value in applying the same solutions we're wanting to use to train attention, and in particular these three systems, even to solve the media usage issues we've got, social media engagement issues we've got now. But I don't think that alone is sufficient. I think there needs to be accountability for what's going on too.
Accountability to the government, you mean a top-down
I mean, there
solution?
has to be some kind of regulation. If they're not gonna if they're not gonna regulate themselves, like for example, just having the ability to not scroll, but having to click to advance gives you a pause point. And you know this when you're reading articles online. It's like, okay, do I want to go to the next page or am I done reading for now? You have more of a just the act of the kind of slot machine act of, what am I going to get next with that lack of pause can be problematic. So instituting, knowing what the brain's attention system does, knowing that that's the commodity that you are gaining, that you're actually manipulating, and then us requiring that technology companies do more for us. So you get notifications every now and then that say you've been on for 7 minutes. Do you want to continue? Or make me advance to the next screen? Or say, this is the fifth video of this type you've seen. Do you want to continue? We're asking the technology to help us make better choices for ourselves because of our vulnerability. Frankly, the vulnerability of our attention.
So an opt-in choice architecture that would be easy to implement in social media companies, like on Twitter, for example, when you go to forward a article, it asks you, did you read this?
Yep.
You want to read this first? Yeah, something like that. I know when I flip my phone on when I'm driving, it says, are you driving? No.
Yeah.
I don't know how it knows I'm driving, but it must be the speed at which the phone's moving or something like
Yeah.
that. So just more of that kind of thing.
Yeah. It reminds me, like when I went to, it's funny, I'm Indian. So I went to India, um, like after we already had cell phones here, but no, sorry, it was even before that, cars were not common in India when I was there when I was a child, right? So we would not, there was no highways really. We would be in the little rickshaws in the town. And then all of a sudden, my family was so excited when I went there and they had highways. They're like, "Oh, come, we're going to take the car, we're going to go on the highway." So I'm like on this highway. It's serious multi-lane freeway and they have no airbags and they have no seatbelts. And I was like, "Where's the airbag? Oh, we don't have those yet." It's like that. It's like I think that if technology develops, the corrective to protect has to be in place, and I think we need that corrective for this particular technological development. And I think we know what it is. We just need to implement it. And the problem right now, which is why I think the regulation piece comes in, is there's not a financial benefit to doing that. If your commodity is going to be less available to you, why would you why would you spend the money to make less money?
Yeah,
So it's a tricky
yeah,
place.
yeah. As that Facebook whistleblower pointed out, although maybe social pressure would be enough. I mean, Facebook changed its name, whatever that means. So did the tobacco industry. Companies did that.
Yeah.
But Zuckerberg seems like he wants to not just be an asshole and just say, screw you all, we're going to make money as fast as we can. He does seem he has some social conscience there, I think. Maybe he has a board that doesn't allow him to do that. Who knows? But all right, let's talk about police and military, another part of our national conversation. We just got out of the longest war in history. Why do soldiers kill innocent people? Why do police kill innocent people or people of color? And try to and instead of just going to the default, well, they're racist. It seems to me a signal detection problem in which your work on attention matters. If you're trained to look for bad guys, this is your job. You got to go to the inner city. You got to go to this foreign country city where the terrorists are allegedly hiding. So they're kind of pre-programmed, confirmation bias and all that, to see the bad person. That's what they're supposed to do. And it seems to me that is a problem that you're working on. That is an important one to try to solve.
And it kind of goes back to the system one, system two. So you've kind of trained to the point where certain stimulus elicits a certain automatic response. Unfortunately, there's more discernment that's required. So even if you do something like a shoot no shoot drill, we actually just published a paper on this. I was just posted it yesterday, where we know when you have shoot no shoot drills, especially if you have them under stress, people make a lot of mistakes. Mostly they're commission errors. They shoot the people they should not shoot. And so the question is, what can you do about this? If this is a typical tendency for the nature of the job, the nature of the training, is there anything you can do so that there are fewer commission errors? Because we want that. And can you not sacrifice the getting the hits when you need them, but not getting not pulling the trigger when you shouldn't? That's the question we asked when we introduced mindfulness training, actually, is if, and this is a topic I haven't even used that term yet in my conversation with you, but out of all the different things we looked at with regard to training regimes to help attention, so that all three of these systems, the flashlight, the floodlight, and this executive control, could be benefited, we saw a lot of benefit with other programs, like brain training games, for example. Except when you changed any of the superficial parameters of the game, people fell apart again. So the brain will learn, the brain can get trained, but the question is, can it be a generalizable benefit where we're tapping into strengthening the system, not the particular instantiation of what the system does? And it literally could be like you have X's and O's that you're trained on, and now I put in apples and oranges, and all of a sudden you can't do well on the game. So that has to do with just being able to have the core capacity in place, and a lot of challenge getting training that will have generalizable benefit for attention. Um, Mindfulness is one of the only things that we've found consistently has generalizable benefit for attention. And I think part of it is because And we know this, by the way, because what do we have people do when we have them do something called mindfulness training? And I don't know if that's a topic you've covered before. I don't think I've recall hearing any of your prior shows talking about mindfulness, but maybe I say a
Not
word or
much,
two
no.
about it just to,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
please, yeah.
So mindfulness, yeah, yeah. So mindfulness is really a mental mode. It's a way of making the mind. It's an intrinsic capacity we have to pay attention to our present moment experience without a story about it, without reacting to it, and realizing what is occurring in that moment. So it's sort of this meta aware, present centered attention. And we know we can do this. I mean, I'm sure, many times in your life where you felt focused and present and aware of what's going on and not necessarily elaborating on it, just you're in the moment. You might even say in the zone, if you will. But oftentimes we aren't in the moment. We're fast forwarding or rewinding, we're ruminating or catastrophizing, or we're in somebody else's head. We're not in our own mind and in our own direct experience. So, because we knew all these vulnerabilities of attention, the sources of distraction that you and I were just talking about a few moments ago, are real, and that they're real for service members in particular, going back to this shoot, no shoot drill example, we wanted a training solution. So we offer training in something called mindfulness meditation. And I'll tell you, I never thought in a million years as a neuroscientist that meditation would enter my lab's research, especially, frankly, coming from an Indian background. I mean, it's a big part of the culture I grew up in and certainly valued by many family members. I was a real skeptic. I was just like, yeah, until there's evidence, I'm not, no, I don't think so. Of course, when we tried a lot of things, including mindfulness, and found it was one of the only things that consistently showed generalizable benefit, my tune changed. And then I was like, okay, this seems to be working and we can make it very efficient, which is frankly, when I wrote this book, Peak Mind, I wanted to offer all that we had learned over 15 years. That was really the most time efficient way we could introduce mindfulness to help people pay attention. Anyway, so the kinds of practices that we do, which goes back to that question of generalizability, is we would have them, for example, a very common practice in mindfulness is paying attention to your breath related sensations. It's not about manipulating your breath or doing some kind of yogic breathing. It's just breathing is happening. We're breathing all the time. Thankfully, we don't have to make ourselves breathe, or else we'd probably be dead because we'd get distracted and then we'd forget to breathe and done. So breathing occurs. We use that as a handy way to guide, to direct the focus of our flashlight. We just use that as the target. So we say, for these few minutes, I'm going to settle in, let's say a minute to start. We ask people to work up to 12 minutes, but we won't do the practice, but I'll just name it that you take your flashlight, you focus it on breath related sensations, something prominent in your sensory experience, coolness of air, maybe you can feel your chest moving up and down, whatever it is. That's the target for your flashlight. So, first instruction is focus, engaging the flashlight. Second instruction is notice when your mind wanders. Not your mind should never wander. Your mind was wander. 50% of our waking moments are mind wanders. Notice when your mind wanders. Notice it. Mind is wandering. Meta awareness. When you do, take that flashlight, gently redirect it back to breath related sensations. So, that third redirection is basically the executive control kicking in and saying, that's not the intended thing I should be focusing on now. I've got to get back on track. So focusing, noticing, redirecting over and over again. Now, how are they doing this? Privacy of their own homes with their eyes closed, focusing on their breath. Now we bring them into the lab and we have them do a attentionally demanding task with numbers, letters, faces, whatever it is. And what we see is before the training versus after the training, there's an improvement after of just having done these practices in the intervening weeks. So that's a pretty strong test of generalizability. We're not having them do a breath related task. We're not having them close their eyes and focus on body sensations. They're doing something very different, and we see the benefit. So anyway, so that was the kind of training that was offered to these soldiers. And what we found was that when they did these practices, about 12 to 15 minutes, 3 to 5 days a week, they showed fewer errors of the type we were talking about. Shooting when you shouldn't, not shooting when you should. So
And
there's a very
what?
concrete example of how it causes
Yeah, no,
results and
that's
benefits.
that
Yeah.
that's an amazing finding and super important and useful. But what is it exactly that's happening? They're able to pick out the cues in the environment that this signals a terrorist and I should shoot because he's got a gun and not a cell phone or something like that.
I think it's all three systems. You're more acutely able to focus on the target. You're not wandering away. You're not imposing your story about what's going on. You're actually getting more data coming in, and you're more aware of what the goal is. So if you think about from that systems point of view of these three brain systems of attention and the big vulnerabilities of mind wandering, distractibility, storytelling, not having full situational awareness, now you have more of that so that the decision making and the actions that follow are higher integrity. And, it's not just service members and shooting it. We actually see it even in medical and nursing professionals. They're picking up indicators from what patients present to them from symptom clusters or symptomology, or, other business leaders being aware that, oh, the data that I'm getting from all these people, I need to make this kind of a decision. So students learning better and performing better on tests and quizzes. So we see it in many different realms that when you improve attention in this way, when you dial down mind wandering and rumination, the integrity of your performance is higher. And frankly, that's again going back to what I mean by peak mind, is if the reason we can't be at our peak is because we're distracted away in some sense, if we can train for more access to what we already have and dial down the vulnerabilities because of our own minds going in places that are not helpful, we can probably perform more at what we consider our peak.
I forget from the book if you've worked with police on this problem. Because they too do, I think they do shoot no shoot drills and make commission errors, and that's part of the problem with the whole defund the police. It seems like there's just too many errors that are being made, particularly against people of color, and therefore something needs to be done. I would think your training would be really good for that.
Yeah, it's something. I mean, I've written a couple grants. We haven't initiated any projects yet, but I would certainly love to do that. But the other thing is that, a lot of times when we get into this whole bias reduction conversation, like, we can improve, we can offer training, et cetera. But the approaches for a lot of bias reduction is like, look inside yourself to notice that you are biased. And a lot of emerging research suggests that that's not a fruitful direction to go in. Don't worry about why you have the bias, except you probably do. I mean, I'm a woman, yet I know I have sexism because I live in a sexist culture. I feel like I don't discount people who are not, of the primary dominant white race, but I probably do because I live in this culture. So it's almost like, who cares? We're all in this set point. We're all in the same stew. What's the right approach? Well, I think, again, it goes back to strengthening attention. If we keep at the front of our minds the way in which we want to behave, the way in which we think a well functioning, ethically oriented, democratic, fair society should function, that will help us. So it's, again, if we don't know what we should be doing, we're going to have less chances of getting there. And it's interesting because I think now a lot of like HR firms, et cetera, are starting to use different approaches for bias reduction in hiring. It's like, who cares why you have the bias? Assume you do, and keep at the front of your mind, literally on a Post-it note of the values you hold in the decisions that you're going to make next.
Yeah. Here's how I think about that. I think while it's true, there are still some racist, misogynist bigots out there for sure. There's never going to be zero. I think we have made considerable moral progress over the last 50 years, where most people now are much more socially liberal. I like to say conservatives are more socially liberal today than liberals were in the 1950s. We've all had our consciousness raised. We've all expanded our moral sphere to be less judgmental of people who are different from us, and younger generations, millennials and Gen X and Gen Z and so on, are even better than us baby boomers and so on. And I am skeptical of the implicit association test that's allegedly measuring unconscious bias.
You're not the only one.
Yeah, and I think that hasn't survived the replication crisis. I don't think it's measuring what people think it's measuring. So, but I like your attitude that regardless of that, these are good reasons to do the mindfulness training, because we're all going to make errors in our thinking.
Exactly. And it's not really even about the bias you hold. It's about the action. Like, I'm just much more practically oriented. Like, you can be the most unbiased person, but if you act in a discriminatory manner, that's not cool. Like, don't do that. So, because we don't hold those as the values of the organization that we represent, for example. So that's where it comes down to it. In the same way that I know that when soldiers engage in commission errors, they're not necessarily hating anybody. They made an error. They made an error, and what we care about is reducing that error. They would acknowledge it as an error, and we just don't want as much of it. So what are effective ways we can train to protect against that? And that's sort of been my main thing.
Yeah. I do think a lot of the sensitivity training programs in corporations and universities are designed for legal reasons. That is to say, if something bad happens, some professor does something with a student he shouldn't have done, or the worker with the boss and his employee in a corporation, the company itself or the university itself can say, hey, look, we sent that guy through the training program. Our hands are
Yeah.
washed. We can't help it that he did what he did.
Yeah, I know. And the check the box approach also was a lot of what the military wanted to do for psychological health disorders in soldiers. And it's useless because who cares if they went through the program? They're not feeling better. They're still making mistakes. They're still suffering. And there's going to be a consequence. There are going to be consequences to that. So I agree with you. There's probably all kinds of pressures that do it. But I'm a scientist, so I want to see what works. I want to see
Yeah,
what
of
we can
course.
evaluate
Right.
with the objective tools we have. Because we all agree, probably for the most part, on how it should go, what should be the direction that we behave in, right? Nobody would say, "Oh no, it's okay to have commission errors. It's okay if you kill the wrong people every now and then." No, nobody's going to
Right.
say that.
Right.
But how to
Right.
solve the problem is the tricky part.
Yeah, I would think, yeah, I hope you get that grant for working with police, because it seems to me that's a massive problem of, police is driving around in the car for hours, nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden in 30 seconds, there's some traumatic thing. Oh, they're there at the domestic violence. The couple are screaming at each other and, there's weapons, and boom, all of a sudden they're in this situation. I can't imagine, how anybody could navigate that coolly, but the training I
Yeah, and
think would
it's like
help.
I said, exactly. We know that that has all those features: stress, threat, poor mood, all three in that situation. Yet we expect from our police officers, as we do our service members and our leaders, frankly, in whatever domain, that they're going to operate impeccably. But we know the deck is stacked against them. So I think instead of saying, it's not a selection issue. I mean, the selection may help, but it's a training issue. And I think we're just at the beginning stages of really exploring training. And frankly, I would tell you, I never thought that most of my funding after all these years would be coming from the Department of Defense to study meditation, mindfulness meditation.
Really
But I
funny.
think that they understand that you got to think in ways that are not what you thought were the solutions, because let science tell us follow the science. What is it saying is the most beneficial way to achieve the goals we want? And they thankfully are following the science. We just did a large study with basic combat training where we offered mindfulness training 1,600 cadets. We're also doing a project with one-star generals in the Army. And I think it's part of a culture change to understand, in the same way now it's so normative to think we need to exercise our bodies every day for physical health. But what if we had the same notion regarding our minds? I mean, the military embraces daily physical activity. They created the kind of culture shift that we now all benefit from. Like, you don't see somebody running down the street and think they're being chased. You think, oh, they're just working out. Well, what's the equivalent for the mind? And that's I think what I think is the next gen culture shift that we need to see is training the mind.
And what happens with PTSD in the brain?
I'm not a clinician, so I don't
Oh,
usually
okay.
like to talk
Sure.
about PTSD. I would just be guessing. I'm a neuroscientist, so I can tell you how things work normally. And then when it's
Mm,
not quite normal and there's a lot of dysfunction, many different varieties. But the shorthand is to say attention is not working the way it normally would.
hmm.
It's hijacked very
Right.
profoundly.
Yeah. Right. All right. Let's kind of bring this around to a head here to talk about us normal people. That is to say, we're not soldiers or policemen or under stress. We're just
Yeah.
leading daily
Typical
lives.
everyday folks, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. So mindfulness training, this is a big thing now. My friend Sam Harris is into this. He has his own app, and my friend Deepak Chopra, of course, his whole life has been dedicated to this. My wife and I went to his center, the Chopra Center in Carlsbad, California, for 4 days. It was really quite the experience. I really got a lot out of it. Like you, I thought this meditation stuff's a bunch of bullshit. I'm not going to deal with this. And then, you see, okay, actually the research is looking like it really makes a difference. All right, I'll give this a try. It was hard. I got my little mantra and I'm sitting there, in the quiet room, and and I'm going, oh my God, I'm so bored, as the joke has it. And, I guess, how long does it take for somebody like me who has no experience doing it and just is not into that to really get into it to make a difference? I'm told it takes a while, right? It takes some practice.
I mean, I also don't know if you ever need to get into it, so to speak. Are you somebody who loves to bench press weights every day? Like, is it like you're like, I can't wait to get in the gym and push myself so I'm lifting just a little bit more than I'm comfortable with? Most of us would say, no, I'm not that person. I'll do it if I have to do it. I know I have to do it. So it's that same relationship where it's not that it has to be a struggle, but it's not necessarily done for the purposes of feeling better, from my point of view. I mean, again, this is my particular take. This is a form of exercise, and I'm very clear on what I'm intending to exercise because I look at what the training is asking me to do: focus, notice, redirect. I want to get that workout because I know how it goes for me the rest of the day if I don't do it. Frankly, at this point, I know that I'm going to be off and hyperlinking to the article that I thought I would. I don't need to be reading in this moment or planning my vacation. I remember during the pandemic, it was I was definitely feeling the mental fog, and there was a lot of uncertainty and anxiety going on. I remember one time I sat down to write an email to one of my students actually, and I had that thought of like, I really want to see my mom, and I can't get on a plane. I wonder if I could just buy an RV. And I remember, like, at some point, I'm texting my husband the link to the RV that we're going to buy. And I'm like, all I wanted to do is write this email to this dude. So it's so fast. And I know that, my vulnerability to being in that way, forgetting the goal, not being aware of what I'm trying to get done, vulnerable to these fear and threatening states, it's greater when I don't put in my workout time. So I want my day to go better. I want to advantage myself, which is why I do it. I don't do it because I want to be blissed out. I don't do it because I want to, I mean, personally, I mean, this is for mindfulness in particular. I'm doing it because I want to have more plain ability to pay attention in the moment in a way that gives me the most capacity to see what's going on. So, will it get easier if you do it? I would say you will become more aware of the nature of how it goes. And some days you'll be like, I don't mind wandering at all. Other times you can't go like 10, a half a second without your mind having 10 different thoughts. And in the same way, some days you go to the gym and it's like, you got a great workout, you feel awesome. Other days just like it sucked, but you got through it. You embraced the suck in some sense. So I think that this is also what I meant by the cultural orientation to what these practices are. I mean, I have a lot of respect for meditation in terms of the world's wisdom traditions, right? Whether it's Judaic prayer or Catholic contemplative prayer, monastics have been doing this for millennia. Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist. I mean, these are from literally the world's wisdom tradition, including the philosophical traditions of what the kinds of things Stoics did. But when we bring them to the modern lens of neuroscience, especially with the kind of groups that I'm working with, which frankly at this point is everyday people, because all of us are going to experience stress, threat, and poor mood. The intention is not to transcend anything; it's to be better able to pay attention and address with more success the vulnerabilities that we are likely to encounter. So I do think the whole motivation for me wanting to write this book is because I think these are solutions now that all of us can benefit from. You don't need to be in an exceptional profession. You don't need to be under inordinate amount of stress. Because frankly, even for those people that are in those conditions, what we say is train every day. I mean, I was just on the first plane ride I've been on in a long time. And I remember I'm lifting up my suitcase to put it up. I'm like, what if in this moment I couldn't do that because I didn't have enough arm strength to do it? Would it be appropriate for me to just drop to the ground and start doing push-ups? No, I need to embody the strength so I can use it when I need it. That's why I work out, as often as I do. So I think we need to start thinking of the brain and the mind in that way, which I don't think is the cultural norm right now. So I understand there's going to be an edge there.
Right.
So I hope that
So,
addresses your question
oh
regarding
yeah, yeah.
everyday
No,
people.
that's it. And I don't want to give away your whole book because the final sections are on actual exercises people can do. So let's say somebody's in one of these ruminative loops, the thought flooding. They're
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
they're rehearsing, what they should have said to the boss or the coworker or whoever pissed them off, and they just can't get it out of their mind. So you would just say, go into just take 1 minute or 2 minutes, close your eyes, go through your breath. Or you had another one where you go from your toes up to your top of your feet and then up your legs to your
Yeah,
knees and
so
so
no,
on.
these are not this is not about Just like I would consider the being stuck in that ruminative loop kind of like the equivalent of wanting to put your suitcase up above. That's just a punctate moment. That's an individual event, but we've got to train for it so we address that event differently. So there are things we can do in the moment, but the basic point is understand the distractibility of the mind, be aware of what's going on in your mind moment by moment, and have practice redirecting your attention as you will. That's the tricky part. It's like oftentimes when we're in that loop, we see this is the 15th time I've said this to myself. And if you're talking to somebody else and you're ruminating, they'll be like, how many more times you're going to talk about this? We heard it, but you feel like you cannot escape. You're truly in mud. So the way that I would say that in the moment practice, and yes, there's all kinds of ways we can do this: the breath awareness, the body scan. But the one I'm thinking of right now for the rumination in particular is another one of these practices that I describe in the suite. But a way to address it in the moment would be something like I call like the bird's eye view. So in that moment that you notice, oh my gosh, I am ruminating, I am stuck. First of all, that's a win. You just acknowledge your current state. It didn't take somebody else saying to you, it's the 15th time you said this, stop. You said it to yourself, you notice it. What you do in that moment is essentially, because remember, the flashlight is singular. You can't be in the moment experiencing it and somewhere else. So take that flashlight and kind of take a bird's eye view, direct it back at yourself, and describe the situation. Amishi's feeling really stuck right now, and use the third person. Literally describe as if you're a reporter from the helicopter above, like, okay, what's going on right now is Amishi feels really bad about that interaction she had with her coworker. She is actually really regretting that it happened. Give the play by play. And frankly, that's a lot like what we do with expressive writing journaling. We kind of take a distanced view of what's going on. That will help break you. You cannot be in the moment and watching at the same time. So you have a little bit of distance. After that, one of the things we cultivate through the practice, that's just an in the moment, get out of the loop. With the practice, what we cultivate is a steadiness that allows us to not have to even do anything. So if I did have, if that and that kind of thing still happens to me, I mean, it happens to all of us all the time, but you feel the rumination, you watch the mind doing this, you notice that you're stuck. This next thing to do is take a real steadiness approach. So sometimes we talk about it as like taking a mountain pose. Like I'm a mountain. Like a mountain doesn't care if there's a rainstorm or windstorm or snow or beautiful meadow, flowers. It's just itself. It's there for all of it, and it's not really reacting to what's going on. It's maybe there's an observation that things are shifting, but there's nothing to do differently. And that also helps the ruminative content just kind of move away. I mean, that nature of the mind is that it's going to wander. So what we're doing with rumination, that I think is the big insight, is it's not staying there on its own. You are re-enlivening it with every turn. You are actively participating in churning that wheel in your mind. So if you can take this distant stance, just observe, maybe even I would say this is where the body scan that you're mentioning can be helpful. Feel the body sensations associated with it. Oh my gosh, with this thought, I feel tightness in my stomach. My jaw's clenched. That's another way of taking the flashlight, not maybe bird's eye view, but from within the body, scanning it. It will start shifting. You will not stay in that same state. And in fact, it may shift it in a way that's going to help you out of the loop in a productive manner. Like, you know what? Maybe I should write that email and I'll sleep on it and then maybe I'll send it tomorrow. So
Always a
those
good
are some
idea
ways that we
anyway.
can do.
I do
Yeah,
that, the
yeah,
body
yeah.
scan thing. When I can't fall asleep at night, I'll do the body scan thing, start at my toes and work my way up. And I'm usually asleep by the time I get to my knees. So it works pretty well.
Honey, I agree. It's a very good way to fall asleep.
All right, the
And
last
and
thing I
part
want
of
to
it is
ask you
because
about.
typically,
Oh, go ahead.
oh god, I was just going to say part of the way reason is that we stay up because our mind is spinning.
Hmm.
So just
Yeah,
steadying the
right.
mind really
Yeah,
helps
that's
quiet
right.
it and drift off.
Right.
Go ahead,
Well,
sorry.
so and the last thing I wanted to ask you about was that idea of living in the now, which you hear a lot about. I read Eckhart Tolle's book years ago, The Power of Now, and then after the Deepak trip, he and I kind of became friends. So he invited Leonard Mlodinow, the physicist, science writer, and I to go to an event with him and Eckhart Tolle at the Shrine Auditorium in L.A. It was quite the show. I mean, it was like 3,000 people paid a couple $100 a ticket. And it's just Deepak and Eckhart up there, and they're like jeans and t-shirt and socks or bare feet or whatever. I mean, it was pretty casual. And I thought, my gosh, the rise of the nuns and people falling out of mainstream religion may be happening, but maybe they're not becoming atheists and skeptics. They're becoming kind of New Age or Buddhist, Western Buddhist philosophy or something like this. In other words, there is some kind of need that people have to address this issue. And this idea of living in the now, I think, is what you're talking about. And I'm trying to understand this, because one of the first thoughts I had of this living in the now is, yeah, that sounds great, but my mortgage is due next week, so I got to plan ahead. I got to go to work, and that all sounds kind of airy fairy. But on the other hand, I could see the benefit of But what is the now? Paul Bloom cleverly said it's the length of time it takes Paul McCartney to sing "Hey Jude," not the song, just "Hey Jude." That's it. That's the now. That's now.
Exactly.
So how do you balance that? My past matters to me. I want to learn from my mistakes so that my future self has a better life. But I don't want to miss the now. And that's much of your work on attention deals with that.
Yeah.
That paradox.
So here's what I would say. You, even if you want to be in the now all the time, won't. 50% of our waking moments, we will be mind wandering. It is the built-in, baked-in evolutionary inheritance we walk around with, and it's good. It's useful. It's what got us here. It allows us to productively reflect and plan. We won't get rid of that, and we shouldn't get rid of that. And of course, we have to do all the things that our complex human mind and physical form requires. But that number, 50%, will go up under circumstances that are stressful, threatening, or negative. And those are the moments of our lives. So what I'm interested in is not the baseline amount of stuff that happens. Of course, we got to pay our mortgage and we've got to think about how we're going to afford sending our kid to school or whatever it is. We have to be reflective, planful, and act responsibly. It's the additional burden that we put on our own mind by this mental time travel and mind travel that drives down not just our productivity, but our well-being that we have some control over. And all I'm saying is practicing some of these things can at least keep it in the 50% range so that we're not spending this stuff out by overly privileging the not now and missing all the moments that we want to be. And really, it's about having these capacities on demand. A lot of the people that I talk to that are very high power people, professionals that are constantly on the go, we can't steady ourselves long enough to watch a sunset or even hear the entire song, Hey Jude, or see our kids' ballet recital or hold your child in your lap and feel their warm bodies. Like, we're not here because why? We're not here because our mind is somewhere else. And wouldn't it be great if in those moments we could remember, oh, I have this capacity, show up right now. It's not that I won't be able to pay my mortgage if I do that. It's that I have an extra tool to actually live my life. And that's what I'm interested in.
Good place to end it there. Thank you, Amishi. Thank you for your work. What's next on your research agenda?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of exciting things in the lab. We're constantly trying to find better solutions. The next kind of adventure is more scalable delivery models. How do we get mindfulness? If we're able to help a group of cadets, how do we get it to 300,000 people? How do we train in a way that is beneficial? So we're looking at train the trainer approaches. And also looking at some of the things I was mentioning to you. How does this have consequential effects on performance? I'd love to move in directions like we were describing with first responders, et cetera, police officers.
Yeah, and athletes too. You talk about that in the book too.
Yep.
Anyway,
yeah,
all good stuff. All right. Thank you, Amishi. Thanks for coming on the
all
show.
right.
Thank you for your
This
work.
was a lot of fun.